It's key. What is the load? How well are we characterizing the baseline today, and what do we think is going to happen in the future? And why is this important? What is the status quo? So as you can see here on this graph, 1975 through 2010, we had the big uptake of air conditioning. So from the 70s to the 2000s, utilities accommodated that load. But then for the last 10, 15 years, it has been very, very flat. So we've had uptake of energy efficiency, DERs, behind the meter resources installed at customers. And we have been definitely, the planners have been not required to think very precisely what was going to happen in the future. They had time to react when something was coming, is the big thing. And in general, the methods that they used to predict the future, the past was a good representation of the future, as you can see in these years, in the last 10, 15 years. Why is this changing? Econometric modeling, which is the methods that have been used historically, so to use typical load, typical weather, it's not sufficient anymore to predict what's coming. Customers are adopting new technologies, so we need to understand what is the gross load versus the net load. So it means like the native demand of a house versus the generation, the renewable generation. We need to understand where and when these technologies are being adopted to be able to react. And we are seeing very rapid adoption trends of technologies that we didn't have before. So we have the customer dynamics clearly changing. And then we have another adder, which is that past weather might not be representative of future weather. So we also are having to adapt to that. A great influencer of this is policy. So from the federal to states to local jurisdictions have been adopting very aggressive policies and goals to reduce carbon emissions and meet renewable energy targets. And so the forecasting exercise has changed from, again, the past may be a good representation of the future, to now, well, what does this new policy mean? What does this new target mean? And how do I change it? How do I convert it into assumptions on technology adoption? Who and where are they going to adopt? And how are the technologies going to operate? So basically turning the new decisions by the federal government, the states, and the local jurisdictions into a load profile that you can forecast into the future is the key challenge now in load forecasting. So what does this mean? That now we have these goals to 2030, 2035, 2040, and even 2050. And distribution planning has typically only looked at 3 to 5 years. So they were, it was fine, right? With what was coming, they had time to react and they would adapt. And so these smaller cycles were okay to accommodate the customer needs. But now, with pushing the boundaries with these aggressive goals and the added stress of long lead time on grid infrastructure assets, there's an increased pressure for distribution planners to develop methods to be able to forecast and look out and plan a little bit further ahead. So that is something that I encourage you guys to think about. Yes, fine maybe for some specific projects to use this shorter term, but what is the long-term strategy? What is the time horizon, as Lisa presented earlier? And you can see here some ways of forecasting out and planning. And distribution planning has always forecasted in this way. It's called a single point forecast. And so they had their distribution feeders, their substations. They produced one forecast out for the next 5 years. It was a clear enough future right? So they knew what was going on in the neighborhood. If they had a new customer load, they would include it and be able to respond. And it served well for making those decisions. But clearly now, with the uptake of electrification, transportation, building, behind-the-meter PV and storage, pricing, we are definitely recommended at least to consider these other ways of planning, which is considering alternate futures. So interesting questions to ask in the plans is, have you considered alternate scenarios, right? So you want to make sure that the decisions that are being made on these big budgets are at least considering different ranges of futures, and that they're going to be valid and adaptable to different futures. So this is a summary of sort of where we are in load forecasting for distribution planning. I will describe the past and the present and then the future. I will say that this slide comes from Eversource, and so they describe this as present, which is what they've done for the first time in their planning, in their infrastructure planning last year. But most utilities are between the past and the present. So where most of them are is that they look at a 5-year time horizon. They use economic trends to forecast the future, so demographics, economics. They might start to do some DER adjustments to that forecast. So how much PV did I have? Might I adjust a little bit the peaks in my circuits for DRs? But not all of them are including most of the DRs that are going to be very disruptive in the future. A lot of them used to do system level, and then very deterministic, as I was commenting, so that one clear feature, just one point was forecasted out to make a decision on yes or no, we need an upgrade. The present, a lot of the utilities have realized that they need to develop advanced forecasting techniques to predict a little bit further out and be able to proactively prepare for it. 8760 trends, so what this means is you need to start understanding all of the hours of the year, not just the peak. This is mostly due because of EVs, building electrification, PV. They are going to have a profile that is going to might affect the peak load, but it might also change the peak load. And so you really need to start understanding the load profile over the course of a year, not just the peak. DR adoption and spatial allocation. Cody Davies is going to talk a little bit more about that. We need to start understanding better where, and more granular. So substation, feeder level, and at least look at a few scenarios so you can make sure that your plans are robust. Where the future is going is not just understanding what's happening at the substation and at the feeder, but really at the customer. Customers are the ones that are going to be driving this. And so customer modeling and understanding how are they going to respond to prices, how are they going to adopt the technologies is really where the methods are going. And then moving from scenarios, pushing the boundaries to more probabilistic thinking. So resource adequacy and the bulk transmission planning and the market has used these probabilistic methods before. We're starting to think how to bring those down to the distribution system, so that instead of making this single point decision, yes, no, we need to upgrade something, we start understanding maybe better, well, what's the probability? What is the uncertainty around this? Very good. Who performs load forecasting? This is a slide that I keep adapting every time I present. So I am chairing the load forecasting task force, the long-term load forecasting task force for the Energy Systems Integration Group. It's an industry group, ISOs, utilities, technology providers. And I'm trying to understand how many people are doing load forecasting at a state, for example. And it's very interesting. You have the ISO. They perform their own load forecasting. You have, within the utilities, you have 3 different departments that do load forecasting. You have the traditional load forecasting department is the financial department, the one that does rates, sales, and revenue. They have their system level energy and peak forecast. Then you have transmission planning. They might use the load forecasting department's forecast. They might use the ISO forecast for the planning. And then you have distribution planning. They produce a different forecast. And so it's been very interesting to start trying to map this. But what I have learned is that typically distribution planning has been performing their own forecast. And so at some point, it's good to start asking the question of, well, you know, why is your financial forecast might be different for distribution? What assumptions are being used where and why? And they are now, a lot of them, trying to connect, you know, within their own organizations to share assumptions that might be useful for both. When you do load forecasting, typically the methods have always looked at predicting energy and predicting the peak, the two key sort of quantities driving decisions. At the distribution level, typically they've never cared about energy. They've only cared about the peak load because it affects the decision making of the distribution. It's going to be capacity planning. So are my assets big enough? And that is determined by the peak. And so distribution planning has always sort of worried about that peak load to determine how big or not the infrastructure might be. And we're going to talk about how some methods that they use to do that. So what they typically rely on at the distribution level, which is very different than the load forecasting department that I was mentioning, they use billing and AMI even sometimes. But the distribution planning, they rely on their SCADA measurements, which is the supervisory control and data acquisition system that they have at the substation and feeder level. So at their big transformer that will distribute the power to the circuits, they have data there. And they spend quite a bit of time manually collecting that data, cleaning it up for abnormalities. So you see here an example of an abnormality where a feeder, and I have here the cheat sheet for, I don't know if everybody's familiar with the terms that I'm using, but the distribution circuit typically starts at the distribution substation that has transformer banks. Then there's the feeder that distributes in the neighborhood. And at the end, the service transformers that will bring down the voltage to the customers. And so here's where the big decisions and the plans typically happen for distribution planning, and the forecasting is at the distribution substation and maybe at the feeder head. And so this is an example of a feeder in blue that picked up for 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 days, picked up the load of another feeder. It's called a reconfiguration. And so you don't want to plan for this abnormal event. And you want to clean up your data to have the normal operating conditions. Utilities a lot of times don't have great tools to do this in an automated way. And so they spend a lot of time, you know, the area engineer will have some number of feeders assigned, and they're trying to clean up this data. There are some software providers and methods that are being developed to be able to do this in a more automated fashion. And then once they determine the peak load for the previous years at the distribution or feeder head, they're going to generate what is called a 1 in 10 load forecast based on historical weather. So we're going to talk a little bit about what that means. But basically for distribution planning, they like to use this 1 in 10 or 90th percentile load because it's assets that need to be sized for peak. So you do want to size them for the peak events, but maybe not for the one peak that has happened in the 30 years, but the 90th percentile event. So 90% of the time, the load has been below this is sort of their risk planning method here. And what do I mean by the weather normalization? So what they do is you want to normalize for to accommodate the fact that weather year after year is very chaotic, right? So we do have annual cycles, but it's very hard to predict when the hot day or the cold day is going to happen. And so weather normalization is a process that adjusts that energy peak that you measured at your substation for what would have happened under normal weather conditions. And we'll see what an example of what that means. And so it is good to start understanding what techniques are distribution utilities doing, using to do this weather normalization. One, are they doing weather normalization or not? And if they're doing it, what techniques are they using to come up with this normal weather that drives peak for forecasting? And so peak load is not driven by the same type of weather as energy. So if you're trying to forecast energy, you might use one type of weather normalization technique versus if you're trying to predict peak. Peak load is typically driven by consecutive days in a row of heat, and typically it occurs on a weekday, not on a weekend or a holiday. And so in some years the extremes are going to be more than others, and then in some years the extremes might occur on a weekend, and you don't want to use that data point. You want to normalize it so it's a little bit higher for your planning. And this is an example of that, of peak producing weather. In July here, you have in red the maximum temperature, in green the average, and in blue the minimum. So in July, the maximum temperature that typically drives peak load in their models occurred on 4th of July. And so it did not drive the peak load of the system. The peak load actually occurred on July 18th, which is marked there. The same here for the cold peak driving. I think the coldest day was here towards the end of November, or here I think the 28th. And then the peak load in the winter occurred on November 18th. And so you want to try to use a normal weather. So what they do is basically that they create a peak to temperature model from the historical, but then you want to use a normal weather to predict your forecast of the baseline, what is the baseline load that I'm going to use and how I'm going to project it out. So interesting questions to ask, what methods are they using and how. And so this is going to be the result. They're going to use this normal weather to predict the 1 in 10 peak load, typically at every substation and feeder, and it's important that it is granular like that. And then on top of that peak load, so which is your baseline, you might adjust it or not in the future for the economic trend, the forecast of DRs, etc. So we're going to see a little bit what the status quo is on that. Some utilities don't adjust it for DRs yet to date. So they're still not forecasting EVs, and they only take the peak load and will do an economic trend of it. So important to know what is being forecasted in that peak load forecast. What is being included in that peak load forecast. Here's an example of how it worked for Eversource in their latest infrastructure investment plan. So the starting point is here to the left is their economic trend load model. So they have at the substation level their weather normalized peak load that they're going to adjust, as you can see, with different DERs and different loads. So energy efficiency, PV and storage, the economic trend load, the step loads, which are going to be the interconnection of new customer businesses that they do know about, and then the EV growth. And so basically the process is alteration of your current peak load to predict the future. So you go from sort of that weather normalized station peak load to the net load, the forecast that is actually going to include all of the alterations that you want to do for the DRs that are going to be adopted in the future. And Cody Davis is going to talk a little bit about the methods of how to do that with a little bit more granularity since this has to now happen at the substation and feeder circuits to make decisions. This is another form of what I just presented, simplified. So the capacity planning exercise, you take the existing peak load, you might whether normalize it or not, you might adjust it for DRs, and then you also adjust it for the planned load interconnections that you have received from large customers wanting to interconnect. So what are these known loads or step loads that I was mentioning? These are larger, so not residential. They tend to be commercial and industrial developments, upgrades to large existing sites, maybe large multi-unit residential developments. And now they're starting to track also battery storage or EV charging facilities. But is load growth that happens in pockets, and it's very hard to predict. And so they sometimes will take from the customer-facing department. So again, a collaboration between departments, very recent in utilities, where they take the known new large loads that are wanting to interconnect in the system, and they include them in the forecast. So you want to adjust locally your peak for these large loads that you know might be coming. It is heavily reliant on customer-provided information, and not everybody does that. And so another great question to ask the utilities when you receive a forecast used in grid planning is, are you using this data from the customer department to adjust and plan your infrastructure? Some utility in the East Coast just filed an infrastructure investment plan, and they did not use the planned loads. They said, well, that's the interconnection process. That's the other department. They take care of it, but we're not including it in the load forecast. And it is, we are developing, I must say, as a forecaster myself now, methods to use that information also in forecasting. So not just used like what you know, but how can that help you determine what, how might you want to forecast the future. It's also a very big deal now with data centers in the East Coast and in other areas, including these step loads. And so as I was saying, the exercise really, the use case for the load forecasting at the distribution level is the thermal evaluation of the substation and feeder head assets. And the thermal evaluation is a fancy way of saying, is the infrastructure big enough or not? And that's sort of the exercise for which the load forecasting ultimately is going to be used. But as I was saying, now it's really driven by what's happening at the customer level that didn't happen before. You know, it was, the past was a good use of the future, so you just took your past 10-year load to represent the load, and you might, you know, accommodate in the interconnection process for the new load that was coming. You had time to react, but it's not quite the same now. And this was an example of what the exercise looks like. So it's still mostly a spreadsheet level exercise that is going to result in a spreadsheet with the peak facility loading at your substation or feeder head. These are public, by the way, in California. So you can access the substation and feeder at most places. Here you have some that are confidential, as Lisa was mentioning before. But for the most part, you can, the information is not publicly available. But it is a single deterministic forecast still, right? So if the facility is at 80%, I don't do anything. If it's at 99%, I don't do anything. And if it's at 101, I do. That's still the way it's, the information is being used. And so it's still sort of surprising, right, that at 99% you wouldn't do anything and at 101 you would, with a single point forecast that has so much uncertainty in it, right? And so starting to think about if you are receiving this data, you know, as a regulator, I would start to think, well, what are your plans for the 80%? Like, can we do some geo-targeting programs there to prevent it from getting to 100? Or, right, instead of just worrying about the infrastructure that's above 100% and then having to do the NWA solution. Well, those are very likely going to be overloaded, so you might as well do it, but we have all of these ones that are at risk in the long term, right? So why don't we work on those too? Did this get blocked? Nope. I don't think so. There we go. So I'm going to give you an example, again, with California data of why is this becoming more and more important. These are plots of the step loads that I was telling you. So the new customer requests that the utilities in California have been receiving. We have PG&E here and SDG&E here. And so PG&E filed these known loads in 2019, in 2020, in 2021, and 2022. Well, you can see that in 2019, what they thought they were going to get in 2022 was 250 megawatts. By when we got to 2022, so 2 years later, they had 3 times more the amount. And so why is this important? Is that in 2020 and 2019, they were not able to make decisions in order to accommodate that load, and they had to react very fast to it. And the result of that is that the only solution that is going to be able to be done on time is wires, right? So if typically, and Cody might talk about this, non-wire alternatives are now have a timing screen because utilities say it takes at least 3 or 5 years to procure NWAs. It's still a known technology, the procurement process, et cetera, versus an infrastructure project can be done in 1 or 2 years. And so you can see here what happens is that over the course of a year, you can see here, take any of the 3 utilities in blue, for example, SDG&E. These are their filings of planned investments for year 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 of their forecasting horizon in 2020, in 2021, and in 2022. Consistently, the needs happen in the first 3 years. Consistently, the timing screen for NWAs is missed. And so now, when you look at the data, since it's publicly available, you say, well, can we adjust something? Because it seems like now you have the data that is showing that this load is coming, right? Could we do NWAs, in year 4 and 5? But they don't have the methods to do that, and so they only react to the load when it's coming versus be able to proactively plan for it. So important questions to ask. You can review these. I'm going to move forward for time. Why is important what's coming? Quick study facts in California. I was part of a study for the regulator there for the long term that said that by 2035, across the 3 IOUs, the EV impacts is going to be as if we were adding 3 to 9 million residential customers to the system. So it's going to be massive. And different EV scenarios, low, medium, high, are going to result in vastly different infrastructure investments. And so, again, thinking about that single point forecast, I would be nervous now to see a grid plan with a single point forecast that is not considering different scenarios, especially as it relates to electrification. So that is just a chart of percentage feeders being overloaded in different scenarios. It is very different, right? And by the way, in this slide, when I said 3 million to 9 million, the 3 million was using a forecast that now is not used anymore in California because they have adopted the forecast driving the 9 million. So they're saying now that is the reality. So the high is the new normal in California. what we were discussing, deterministic scenarios versus probability. A scenario, you can have here sort of an example of how you can make it, how you can discuss it with a utility. You can have your baseline, which has the load, how many EVs, PV, storage, energy efficiency, building electrification, and then you can choose together what a high case and a low case might be, right? So what is the speed of adoption of all of these technologies? So where are you ending? What's the target? But also how fast or not you might be getting to it. That's a way of doing scenarios. It is still not probabilistic because the scenarios are still deterministic. You know, you are saying there's going to be X amount of EVs by this time, but it allows you to see a different range of features. What probabilistic really means is that each component making the load forecast, so PV, EVs, and within those, each of those models has components for the different scenarios that give you a range of uncertainty. And so that's where we are trying to get to. I haven't seen a probabilistic forecast yet at the distribution level, but we would, instead of just getting, you know, an 8760 curve and a peak, we would get sort of a level of certainty coming from the different components that are contributing to the load. So that's sort of where the research is going to be pushing in the future. And really quick, I haven't had time, I won't have time, but you have the slides here. Weather, adjustment to weather. So very important right now, most of them, yeah, I just wanted to make sure I had time for questions, but I can always come back.
No, that's including questions.
Oh, including questions. Oh, great. So I have time. So I can tell you guys about weather. Excellent. Thank you. You have here the idea of adjusting for climate change. So you see here in gray is the 30-year historical that is being used to determine that normal peaking weather and drive the baseline peak. Well, what we are seeing here is that a lot of times the new weather year that comes has temperatures that had not been seen before. And so we're still trying to, as a community and as part of that load forecasting task force that I mentioned, we're in active discussions on how to use climate weather models to potentially adjust the weather that we're using for forecasting. It's not a trivial task. But basically the idea is that statistical load forecasting based on historical can miss the features extreme events, but that we need hourly climate model projections to be able to do that load forecasting exercise that we do. And the issue there is that the peak load models are typically developed. So you develop a model of weather, so temperature, typically for peak load, and your peak. And it looks typically like a U. So high temperatures drive peak load, low temperatures drive peak load. But that has been trained, you know, that model, or that regression model, typically, statistical model, has been trained on local weather station model. And now we're getting NREL and EPRI and many research organizations are putting out their quite granular load data of what the future climate might be. But your model has been trained on your local station. And so you can see here that the weather station is quite different than the data for the same location in the climate model data. It doesn't quite come out the same, right? The models are models at the end, and they're not exactly what has happened. And so you need to first adjust your own regression model that you're using to predict that peak based on the climate data to adjust for that bias that may come from the different weather data. But, oh, I thought I had one more slide. But the whole point that utilities are trying to get to is, well, now that I'm also pushing, not just for 5 years, but I'm pushing for 10, 20, and 30 years out, do I need to adjust my hot weather day or my cold weather day that is going to drive my peak planning? Do I need to adjust it upwards or lower. But then it's also hard because these models are done on the historical, right? And so now if all my heating is going to change to electric, I also have to adjust the way my regression model works. And I'm not very sure anymore how whether my load is going to really respond to temperature. Heat pumps might be more efficient, less under different temperature levels. And so it involves methods that are being developed right now. So it's sort of the state of the art of where we are at. But it is good to start thinking about if we are pushing, if utilities are starting to file things in the long term, what are they thinking, and are they using any external climate weather data to be able to adjust it? And so I will say, the summary of where we are at versus where we're going, right? So capacity planning, a little bit of a mismatch with the long-term policy goals. So, I think now the utilities are tasked with achieving these policy goals, and so we need to push them a little bit about that proactive long-term thinking. Historical trends are not going to serve us well, and so starting to dig a little bit into what code is going to present later. Well, what are your models for how customers are going to adopt? How are they going to behave? What is their load shape? And at the end, how are you determining where all of these technologies are going, and how are they aligned with ultimately the grid infrastructure? And so you see sometimes that they might make a good effort and have a forecast at a zip code level, but then you have feeders. Feeders don't know about zip codes, right? They cross boundaries all the time. And so they've done all this effort to have a good forecast at the zip code level that then is disaggregated to feeders in a way that is not reliable, and it's not going to serve as a good indicator of the peak load. So digging a little bit there. And where are we going? Developing high spatial and temporal resolution load forecasts, pushing a little bit the long-term scenarios as a critical tool and asset for discussion around risk and uncertainty, and then thinking about including these climate change models and extreme weather events for more reliable and resilient plans. And I think that's all I have. So I would be happy to take questions.